Tonight, we're stepping into a quieter, more organized corner of medieval life. A world where almost every craft, from weaving cloth to shaping iron, followed rules so detailed, so unusual, and sometimes so unexpectedly strict that they shaped entire communities. These weren't laws written by kings, and they weren't guidelines passed down from scholars. They were the everyday expectations of guilds, groups of craftsmen who protected their trades with care, pride, and an endless list of small, curious customs. Some of these rules were practical, some were surprisingly gentle, and some were so oddly specific that they feel almost mysterious today. But together, they formed the backbone of medieval work, steady, predictable, and comforting to the people who lived by them. Before we begin this calm journey, if you enjoy these soft, sleep-friendly stories from the quieter corners of history, don't forget to like the video. And if you want more gentle episodes like this, make sure to subscribe. It really supports the channel and helps this peaceful space grow. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. If you were alive in medieval times, which craft do you think you would have joined? The bakers, the carpenters, the weavers, or something entirely different? Drop your answer below. I always enjoy reading your thoughts. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's quietly step into a world where work was guided not by speed or competition, but by careful rules, patient traditions, and the gentle harmony of craft. In medieval Europe, where life moved slowly and each day followed a familiar rhythm, the rise of guilds seemed almost as natural as the turning of the seasons. They did not appear suddenly or dramatically. Instead, they formed gradually, like the careful stitching of a cloth or the building of a stone wall, one small piece added to another until an entire structure took shape. Long before guilds gained influence or became symbols of craftsmanship, they were simply groups of people who understood that their work and their lives would be easier if they supported one another. And so, step by step, the medieval world developed one of its most fascinating systems, a network of trades governed not by official laws, but by strange, specific, and quietly powerful rules. The earliest stirrings of guild life began in villages where only a few craftsmen practiced a particular trade. A blacksmith, a carpenter, a tailor, a potter, each worked alone or with a single apprentice. Their skills were valuable, but the world around them was unpredictable. Prices changed suddenly. Materials were sometimes scarce. Customers expected fairness even when conditions made that difficult. And so craftsmen began meeting informally, exchanging advice, sharing tools, or helping each other during busy seasons. At first, this cooperation felt simple, natural, even ordinary. But over time, these craftsmen noticed something important. When they supported one another, their work improved. Their lives became steadier. Their trade grew more respected in the community. This realization led to the very first guild-like gatherings. These were not formal institutions at first. They happened quietly, sometimes in workshops after a long day, sometimes in the warm corner of a tavern, sometimes in the open air near a marketplace. Craftsmen talked about their challenges. They shared techniques. They agreed, often without writing anything down, that they would set certain standards for their work so that customers knew what to expect. These early agreements were small, but they planted the seeds for something much larger. As communities grew and trade routes expanded, the idea of organizing began to spread as well. A craftsman traveling from one town to another might bring stories of how workers in his home village had agreed on certain rules, perhaps about the quality of materials, or how apprentices were trained, or what price should be charged for a common type of work. The craftsman listening to these stories might return home and discuss similar ideas with his neighbors. Gradually, village after village adopted such practices until entire regions found themselves guided by shared, though still very informal, expectations. But informal agreements could only last so long. Eventually, craftsmen realized that their trades needed more structure, something that would protect their livelihoods, maintain standards, prevent disputes, and ensure fairness. And so, slowly, guilds emerged as formal associations. They developed names, meeting places, and a sense of identity. What had begun as quiet cooperation now became a defining feature of medieval urban life. As guilds took shape, they created rules, not dramatic rules that reshaped society, but small, specific guidelines that governed nearly every detail of their work. These rules might seem unusual today, even overly precise. But for medieval craftsmen, they were comforting. They brought predictability to a world where so much remained uncertain. They created stability in towns where opportunities were closely tied to one's trade. And they helped craftsmen feel connected to something larger than themselves. One of the first rules many guilds adopted involved the training of apprentices. Trade skills could not be learned quickly. They required patience, repetition, and attention to detail. Guilds established that apprentices must work for a certain number of years, often 7, sometimes more, before they could become full members. This wasn't meant to restrict people. It was designed to protect the trade itself, ensuring that every new craftsman carried the same level of skill, the same habits, and the same respect for the work. During these years, apprentices lived in the homes of their masters. They woke early, learned slowly, practiced repeatedly, and absorbed the quiet rhythms of the trade. They didn't simply learn how to shape wood or forge metal. They learned how to behave as craftsmen. They learned the expectations of the guild, the customs of their trade, and the strange little rules that governed everything from how tools were stored to how finished work was inspected. These small rituals shaped the apprentices just as much as the skills did. Once an apprentice completed his training, he became a journeyman. This stage, too, followed quiet but meaningful rules. A journeyman traveled from town to town, finding work wherever he could. The journey was not meant as a test of physical endurance, but as a way to observe how others practiced the same trade in different places. Each workshop he visited added another piece to his understanding of his craft. He learned new methods, saw different techniques, and witnessed how guild rules varied from one region to another. When journeymen returned home, they often brought valuable knowledge, small improvements in how to temper metal, how to cut cloth, how to measure wood more precisely, or how to fire pottery more evenly. These insights weren't dramatic discoveries. They were subtle refinements that shaped the quality of work across generations. Guilds encouraged this exchange because it kept the trade alive. It prevented stagnation. It allowed skills to grow without losing their core traditions. Eventually, a journeyman would seek to become a master craftsman. This transition came with one of the most curious guild rules: the creation of a masterpiece. Unlike the grand meaning the word carries today, a medieval masterpiece was simply a demonstration of competence, a piece of work that showed the craftsman had learned the trade well enough to join the guild as a full member. Guild elders examined the masterpiece carefully, not out of harshness, but to ensure consistency. Their standards were surprisingly stable from one generation to the next, reflecting the guild's desire to protect its reputation. Once accepted, a master craftsman gained something rare in medieval life: security. Membership in the guild meant access to work, assurance of fair pricing, the protection of other craftsmen, and participation in decisions that shaped the future of the trade. Guild meetings were often calm gatherings where masters discussed prices, reviewed the work of apprentices, and reminded one another of the rules they had agreed to follow. These meetings followed their own strange customs. Some guilds required members to sit in a specific order. Others insisted on bringing a certain tool as a symbol of their craft, and many opened gatherings with simple rituals designed to reflect the guild's unity. But perhaps the strangest rules of all were the everyday ones, the quiet expectations that governed how craftsmen behaved. Some guilds required members to keep tools arranged in a precise order, believing that a tidy workshop led to better work. Others insisted that craftsmen could not begin work before a certain hour of the morning or must stop at a specific hour in the evening. These rules weren't intended to control workers, but to ensure fairness. If one craftsman worked much longer hours than others, it could create imbalance in prices or quality. Even more curious were the rules about pricing. Guilds aimed to prevent competition from becoming harmful. If a carpenter began offering extremely low prices, it could threaten the livelihood of others. So guilds established pricing guidelines: fair, reasonable, and stable. This stability benefited the entire community, since customers knew what to expect and craftsmen knew they would earn enough to sustain their families. In some guilds, members weren't even allowed to advertise their services loudly. Quiet professionalism mattered more than attention. Over time, guild rules shaped the identity of entire towns. A town known for its weavers followed one set of customs. A town known for its pottery followed another. Craftsmen took pride in their guild's rules, even the unusual ones. These rules gave them a sense of belonging. They connected generations of craftsmen who all learned, practiced, and worked in the same careful manner. The strangest part wasn't the rules themselves, many of which seem peculiar today, but how deeply people trusted them. In a world without formal schooling for trades, without standardized tools or printed manuals, guild rules became the foundation of craftsmanship. They ensured that each product, whether a pair of shoes, a piece of furniture, or a tool, reflected the accumulated wisdom of countless workers before them. And so guilds, with all their unusual customs, slow traditions, and deeply specific expectations, became one of the most stable forces in medieval life. They guided workers gently, offering a sense of purpose, clarity, and community. Their rules were strange at times, but in their quiet way, they shaped the rhythm of work across centuries. As medieval towns grew busier and trade routes settled into reliable paths, guilds that had once existed as small clusters of craftsmen began to take on a larger role in shaping the daily lives of entire communities. What started as simple agreements between neighbors gradually transformed into carefully structured systems that governed everything from how a trade was practiced to how craftsmen behaved, learned, taught, and even interacted with one another socially. The quiet strength of guilds came not from force or authority, but from the stability they offered in a world where uncertainty was common. And perhaps what made their presence so uniquely calming was the strange blend of practicality and tradition woven into the rules that guided them. Unlike the formal laws of kings or the policies of town councils, guild rules grew organically. No single person crafted them. They emerged slowly, almost naturally, from the habits, preferences, and shared experiences of workers who spent their lives perfecting small, detailed tasks. A blacksmith sharpening a blade, a shoemaker cutting leather, a carpenter measuring a beam. All of them understood that the quality of their work depended on repeating certain actions with consistency. And when many people repeated similar actions for many years, shared expectations developed. These expectations, once spoken aloud and agreed upon, became the earliest rules of the guild. In their earliest form, guild rules weren't written down. They lived in memory, passed from master to apprentice, from one generation to the next. An apprentice might hear a rule, not during a meeting, but during a quiet moment in the workshop when the master corrected his posture, guided his hands, or warned him about a small mistake that could grow into a serious flaw. These whispered lessons shaped the apprentice's understanding of the trade, not just the technical skills, but the mindset, patience, and discipline required to uphold the quality of the craft. As guilds expanded, the rules became more numerous and more detailed. The more craftsmen joined a trade, the more important it became to ensure that everyone followed similar standards. In some towns, guilds began organizing occasional gatherings where masters discussed challenges and proposed new guidelines. These discussions were rarely dramatic. They unfolded slowly, with craftsmen speaking calmly about what they had seen in their daily work. If a new source of material proved unreliable, they discussed its effects. If a certain method produced better results, they encouraged others to adopt it. Out of these simple conversations came rules that would guide their trade for years to come. One of the most defining types of guild rules involved quality. Medieval customers expected goods that lasted, and craftsmen took pride in meeting those expectations. To maintain this reputation, guilds established clear standards for what counted as acceptable work. A shoemaker's sole had to be a certain thickness. A carpenter's beam had to be measured within a narrow tolerance. A potter's vessel had to be fired evenly with no cracks. These requirements were not enforced with harsh punishment. Instead, they were upheld through a culture of mutual respect. A craftsman who produced poor work often felt pressure not from authority, but from his peers, who wanted the guild's reputation to remain strong. Quality rules weren't always simple. They sometimes included unusual specifics. A baker might be required to use a certain amount of flour for a common type of loaf, not to restrict his creativity, but to ensure fairness in weight and taste. A weaver might be asked to select threads of equal thickness for certain kinds of cloth, because consistency allowed merchants to price their goods more reliably. Even blacksmiths had special rules about how many times a piece of metal needed to be heated before shaping, based on generations of trial and error. These details may seem excessive today, but in the medieval world, where tools, clothes, and household goods were essential and often expensive. Such rules provided comfort to both craftsmen and customers. The second major category of guild rules involved training. Guilds recognized that the survival of their trade depended on passing knowledge to the next generation. Apprenticeship rules often included guidelines about behavior, living arrangements, work hours, and even personal conduct. These weren't intended to restrict apprentices unnecessarily. Instead, they ensured that young workers learned not just the craft, but the discipline, patience, and humility required to practice it well. Apprentices were expected to show respect to their masters, avoid distracting habits, and focus deeply on their training. Many guilds even had rules about how apprentices should help around the workshop or the master's household, reinforcing the idea that learning a trade was also about learning responsibility. Journeymen had their own set of rules. They were expected to travel, learn from different workshops, and return with new techniques or insights. But even as they traveled, they carried the expectations of their guild with them. Some guilds required journeymen to present letters verifying their membership. Others encouraged them to visit certain towns known for particular specialties. And many insisted that journeymen save a portion of their earnings to prepare for the possibility of becoming a master someday. All these rules ensured that journeymen remained connected to their home guild, even while exploring the wider world. The third significant area of guild regulation involved pricing and competition. Medieval society valued stability over rapid change, and guilds played a major role in maintaining economic balance. By establishing standard prices for common goods, guilds prevented undercutting, a practice that could lead to financial instability for craftsmen and create confusion in the marketplace. These price rules were not rigid. They allowed for variation based on materials or special requests. But they created a baseline that helped communities trust the fairness of trade. Guilds also had rules about advertising, though the word didn't exist in its modern sense. Craftsmen were expected to avoid boasting. They were discouraged from publicly criticizing others or claiming superior skill. The idea behind this was simple. The guild's collective reputation mattered more than any individual member's ambition. A stable, respected guild benefited everyone. Conflict undermined this stability, so guilds valued modesty and cooperation. Social rules formed the final category. Many guilds had traditions involving gatherings, meals, or celebrations. These events weren't merely social, they reinforced unity. Members sat in predetermined orders, reflecting their experience or status. Certain toasts were delivered in specific ways. Tools or symbols of the trade might be displayed. These customs strengthened the sense of belonging. They reminded craftsmen that they were part of something older, larger, and more enduring than themselves. Even the quiet rituals carried meaning. A guild candle lit at the start of a meeting represented the light of shared knowledge. A book of names, kept in a wooden chest, connected each new master to the guild's long lineage. Some guilds even maintained rules about how members should help one another in difficult times. If a craftsman fell ill, others could step in to help complete his work. If a workshop burned or materials were lost, other guild members might contribute support. These acts were not just kindness, they were part of the guild's philosophy. A trade survived only if its members supported one another. The rules were simply an extension of this belief. Over time, guild rules grew so numerous and specific that some outsiders found them confusing. A traveler might walk into a town and wonder why shoemakers refused to open their shops before a certain hour. A merchant from another region might question why all the woven cloth had almost identical width. A nobleman might ask why potters always fired their vessels in groups of 10. Each of these rules had a history, sometimes practical, sometimes traditional, but always designed to protect the craft and support the craftsman. What made these rules so uniquely medieval was how they blended practicality with ritual. A rule about measuring would precisely had clear purpose, but a rule about beginning work with a shared greeting between craftsmen spoke more to culture than necessity. These customs strengthened the bonds within the guild and provided rhythm to daily routines. They created predictability, something medieval craftsmen valued deeply. By the time guilds reached their height, their rules influenced everything around them. Markets operated on schedules shaped by guild agreements. Festivals included parades led by craftsmen in their trade colors. Apprenticeship ceremonies attracted crowds who enjoyed watching young members step into adulthood. In some towns, Guild insignia decorated walls, gates, or fountains. Each symbol represented not only the trade but the values behind it: quality, unity, responsibility, patience. And though the strictness of these rules might seem limiting today, in their time, they offered freedom. The freedom to work without fear of unfair competition, unpredictable prices, or inconsistent expectations. The guild shielded craftsmen from the uncertainties of medieval life. It gave them structure in a world defined by change. The rules were not there to confine, they were there to guide. They built a foundation upon which generations learned, worked, and lived in harmony. Through all their complexity, the strange rules of guilds were a kind of architecture, an invisible structure shaping the way people learned, worked, created, and understood their place in society. They were the quiet, orderly backbone of medieval towns, offering stability in a world shaped by season, trade, and time. As guilds grew stronger and more organized, the influence of their strange yet steady rules reached far beyond the walls of workshops. What began as guidance for craftsmen slowly spread into the fabric of medieval towns, shaping everything from daily activities to the layout of streets, from the rhythms of marketplaces to the expectations families held for their children. This influence did not come from loud authority or rigid enforcement. It came from the quiet stability the guilds offered, the sense of order they provided in a world of constant change. And as guild rules became more deeply ingrained, they became one of the most defining features of medieval society: subtle, persistent, and quietly powerful. For many people living in medieval towns, the guild was something familiar long before they ever stepped foot inside a workshop. Children grew up hearing the sounds of craftsmen at work, the steady rhythm of hammers, the scraping of saws, the thump of wooden mallets meeting stone. These sounds created a comforting background to daily life, and families often lived near the very places where these sounds echoed from morning until evening. Children watched craftsmen at their benches, noticing how they moved with precision, how they repeated the same gestures each day, how apprentices followed instructions carefully. Over time, these observations taught children that skill and discipline followed from routine. Even before learning the rules of guilds, they learned the calmness of repetition. Town squares were another place where guild influence could be felt. Markets were arranged according to guild agreements, even if the townsfolk never saw these documents. Bakers, butchers, weavers, potters, carpenters, and smiths each had designated areas, ensuring order and fairness. These placements weren't random or merely traditional. They were governed by the guilds. The strange rules dictating which guilds could occupy which stalls or sell on which days became so deeply rooted in market culture that customers no longer questioned them. They simply understood that on certain days the weavers' stalls were lined along one street, while on other days the potters arranged their goods near the main fountain. The guilds didn't merely regulate the work, they regulated the movement of people. This organization extended to pricing as well. Guilds ensured that marketplaces felt predictable. A traveler entering a town for the first time could buy bread, tools, or cloth without worrying that he was being overcharged simply because he was unfamiliar with the place. Craftsmen agreed upon fair prices, not fixed rigidly, but guided carefully to prevent chaos. And because guild rules discouraged undercutting, the atmosphere in markets felt calm. Craftsmen weren't shouting to attract attention or offering impossibly low prices to win customers. They displayed their work quietly, trusting that the quality and the consistency enforced by guild standards would speak for itself. In many towns, the presence of guilds created a sense of rhythm in the calendar. Feasts and celebrations often centered around guild traditions. A festival might be held when journeymen became masters, or when a guild celebrated its founding date. These celebrations weren't loud or extravagant. They were simple: shared meals, slow processions, decorated tools, or banners hung from windows. Children watched these events with curiosity, knowing that one day they might join the craftsmen whose work shaped the entire town. The guilds gave a sense of belonging that extended far beyond their members. The quieter influence appeared in the architecture. Walk through a medieval town influenced by strong guilds, and you would notice that buildings reflected not just the skills of craftsmen, but the values their guilds upheld. Doors were built to similar sizes, windows often followed the same proportions, and rooftops bore familiar angles. These weren't coincidences. Guilds set standards for measurements so that buildings aligned harmoniously. Carpenters and masons used the same shared units, the same preferred tools, the same traditional methods. This uniformity gave towns a peaceful aesthetic, streets lined with buildings that felt related, shaped by the same hands, built under the same guidance. Even the tools craftsmen used reflected guild rules. Many guilds required members to use materials approved by the guild, whether it was a specific type of wood for carpenters, a certain iron for smiths, or a consistent thread quality for weavers. These requirements created unity in the products townspeople used daily. A barrel made in one workshop fit perfectly with the stand made in another. A door built by one carpenter closed smoothly within a frame crafted by another. Everyday objects became compatible because the guilds insisted on shared standards. This subtle detail strengthened community life, even if most people didn't realize it consciously. Another quiet area where guild rules shaped towns was apprenticeship. Parents often viewed apprenticeships not only as career paths, but as sources of stability. When a child entered a guild, the family gained confidence that he would have consistent work, fair treatment, and a respectable place in society. Guilds protected apprentices, ensuring masters treated them properly and trained them thoroughly. Apprentices learned punctuality, cleanliness, careful maintenance of tools, and the discipline needed to uphold quality. These habits seeped into their personal lives as well. An apprentice waking before dawn to sweep a workshop learned responsibility earlier than many in society. Journeymen, too, carried the influence of guild rules into towns far beyond their birthplace. As they traveled, they brought with them the customs of their home guild, and they returned with new customs learned elsewhere. This exchange created a quiet spread of culture across regions. A weaving technique from one town might appear in another miles away because a journeyman shared it in a workshop. A particular way of shaping handles on tools might travel across 3 towns. These changes happened not through written instruction, but through observation and conversation, the most human forms of learning. But perhaps the most profound influence guild rules had was on fairness. Medieval society wasn't always equal. Opportunity could depend on birth, wealth, or family connections. Guilds offered something different, a path where skill mattered more than background. An apprentice who trained well, worked steadily, and respected guild customs had the chance to become a master. It didn't matter if he came from a modest family or if he had no inheritance. The guild system created a kind of quiet meritocracy, rooted not in ambition but in patience and discipline. This fairness extended to customers as well. Guild rules ensured that the goods people bought were trustworthy. A pot would not crack easily. A cloak would not unravel. A tool would not break on first use. These expectations built confidence in the local economy. People trusted craftsmen because craftsmen trusted their guilds. The strange, detailed rules about the length of cloth, the thickness of sawls, the weight of bread, ensured that trust was never broken. This created a stable environment where people could focus more on living than worrying about being cheated or left without essential tools. Another place where guild rules quietly shaped towns was in conflict resolution. When craftsmen disagreed, whether about prices, techniques, or apprentices, the guild handled the dispute. Members gathered calmly, listened carefully, and applied rules accumulated over generations. This prevented small disagreements from growing into community-wide conflicts. It protected not just the craftsmen, but the peace of entire towns. People knew that guild disputes did not spill into streets or markets. They were resolved through tradition, logic, and discussions guided by shared values. Guild rules also shaped public spaces. Many towns built guild halls, simple but meaningful structures where members could gather. These halls became landmarks not because they were grand, but because they represented stability. Inside these halls, craftsmen planned festivals, supported members in hardship, trained apprentices, and preserved the quiet dignity of their trades. Townspeople passed these halls daily, knowing that behind those wooden doors lay one of the pillars of community life. And then there was charity, one of the guild's least known but most impactful roles. Guilds often helped widows, supported children of deceased members, or provided aid during illness. These acts weren't performed loudly or publicly. They happened quietly, according to guild rules that emphasized responsibility for one another. This charity helped families survive difficult periods and created a sense of security that went beyond individual households. Guild influence also shaped the way people interacted socially. Craftsmen often gathered after work to share news, discuss techniques, or simply enjoy peaceful company. These gatherings reinforced unity. Members of different guilds respected one another's work because they understood the discipline behind it. Towns became communities not just in name, but in daily practice, linked through craft, tradition, and the quiet rules that guided everything from toolmaking to festival organization. By the height of the medieval period, guild rules had become something like the invisible architecture of towns. They shaped habits, expectations, daily routines, and even the emotions people felt about their work. Craftsmen found dignity in consistency. Customers found comfort in predictability. Families found hope in apprenticeship. Towns found peace in order. All of this happened gradually, without noise, without sudden change, just as wind shapes the surface of a stone over many years. The strange rules of guilds, whether about measurements, prices, or behavior, created a calm, reliable world where people felt grounded. They gave medieval towns their unique rhythm, steady, patient, and deeply human. As guilds deepened their roots in medieval towns, their unusual, precise, and steady rules began influencing something far more intimate than trade, markets, or buildings. They began shaping the character of the people themselves, not through harsh instruction or loud authority, but through the quiet, daily expectations that craftsmen absorbed over years of apprenticeship, journeyman travels, and life within the guild. These rules, some practical, some symbolic, some unexpectedly gentle, subtly molded how medieval people thought, behaved, organized their lives, and interacted with one another. Over time, entire communities grew to reflect the temperament of their guilds, carrying a calm, patient, measured way of living that echoed the rhythm of their work. The transformation often began in childhood. Medieval children grew up surrounded by the presence of guilds even if they didn't yet understand them. They played outside workshops, hearing the steady, comforting sounds of labor. They watched craftsmen repeating the same motions, maintaining the same postures, and carefully arranging tools at the end of each day. These small, constant behaviors had a quiet psychological effect on children. Before they ever entered a workshop, they learned by watching. They learned that precision mattered, that careful hands created useful things, that patience led to results, and that every tool had a place. Children saw their parents respect craftsmen for their discipline, and in turn, they learned that consistency was something admirable. Even before officially joining a guild, a child had already absorbed the foundational attitude. Work was steady, predictable, and deserving of respect. And so, when children grew older and became apprentices, the structure of the guild did not feel foreign. It felt like an extension of what they had already witnessed throughout their lives. Apprenticeship formed the center of guild influence on personal character. Apprenticeships could last many years, during which a young craftsman lived with the master's family, worked long hours, learned slowly through repetition, and became part of a small community shaped entirely by the world of the workshop. During these years, apprentices didn't simply learn technical skills. They learned habits that followed them into adulthood. They woke early, swept floors, cleaned tools, prepared materials, assisted in small tasks, and repeated these chores day after day. This repetition, far from being tedious, instilled a deep sense of order. Every guild had quiet expectations about personal discipline. An apprentice learned to remain calm when a task required 3 tries. He learned to observe silently when a master demonstrated something new. He learned to store each tool in its proper place, not because the master demanded it loudly, but because the workshop felt incomplete otherwise. These small habits built the apprentice's character. A shoemaker's apprentice learned to see detail in the curve of leather. A potter's apprentice learned to sense texture with the palm of his hand. A blacksmith's apprentice learned the rhythm of metal. Through these tactile experiences, apprentices developed an intuitive patience. Guild rules reinforced this mindset. Most guilds required apprentices to show respect to elders, avoid idle behavior, and maintain a humble attitude. They weren't expected to speak assertively or make big decisions. They were expected to watch, listen, and try again until they understood the trade completely. These expectations, practiced every day for years, created a calm, measured temperament in many young craftsmen. They learned that improvement came slowly, that expertise required discipline, and that mistakes were part of the process. Because apprentices lived with their masters, they also absorbed domestic habits informed by guild values. They learned to eat meals at regular times, maintain orderly sleeping spaces, and help with household chores. Guilds didn't intend to shape domestic life directly, but they did so through the apprentice's immersion in a master's household. A master who valued structure in the workshop usually valued it at home as well. Thus, guild-trained individuals often built homes later in life that reflected the same quiet order. Tools hung neatly, clothes folded consistently, materials stored carefully. The workshop ethic shaped the household ethic. Journeymen, too, experienced a transformation of character because of guild rules. When they finished apprenticeships, journeymen set out on foot to gain experience in other towns. Their travels were not rushed. They carried letters verifying their training and visited workshops far from home. The journey itself became an education. They learned how different communities worked, how craftsmen from other regions followed their own interpretations of shared rules, and how similar tasks could be completed with slight variations. This exposure to new environments taught flexibility. Journeymen became adaptable. They learned to observe new customs respectfully, to accept unfamiliar techniques, and to integrate new knowledge without abandoning the traditions of their home guilds. Traveling also forced journeymen to develop courtesy. They stayed in unfamiliar homes, worked alongside strangers, and represented their guild during every interaction. This responsibility encouraged humility. They spoke politely. They listened carefully. They understood that the reputation of their home guild traveled with them. This awareness strengthened the character traits already instilled during apprenticeship: patience, calmness, respectfulness, reliability. Journeymen often returned home with a deeper understanding of the world and a quieter confidence. They had seen how different towns applied similar rules, how people lived by similar values, and how craftsmanship connected distant places. The realization that they belonged to a trade much larger than their hometown gave them a sense of belonging and purpose. These feelings shaped their personal identities and strengthened their dedication to the guild. Masters, in turn, became the living embodiment of guild values. After years of learning and working, their behavior reflected everything the guild rules encouraged. They were steady decision makers. They maintained orderly workshops. They treated customers respectfully. They trained apprentices patiently. A master craftsman was rarely a loud or boastful person. The guild forbade such behavior, but even more importantly, guild life never rewarded it. Masters gained respect through steadiness, not through ambition or noise. Their workshops often served as miniature versions of guild culture. Tools arranged by size, materials stored according to type, tasks completed in a predictable order, customers greeted with calm professionalism, apprentices guided without irritation. These workshops shaped the emotional atmosphere of towns. Walking past open workshop doors, townspeople saw routines that never changed quickly, that followed an unspoken rhythm. This consistency gave towns a sense of harmony, each trade contributing to the collective calm. The guild's strange rules about fairness further shaped people's behavior. Because guilds discouraged undercutting and exaggerated claims, craftsmen learned to rely on honesty and transparency. Customers trusted them because the guild rules ensured that trustworthiness was more valuable than clever marketing. Craftsmen often took pride not in selling as much as possible, but in producing work that met guild expectations. They followed measurements carefully, not to avoid punishment, but because accepted standards represented the identity of the entire trade. With these values embedded in daily life, craftsmen developed a sense of integrity. Neatness also became a cultural value in guild towns. In many trades, guild rules required workshops to maintain certain levels of cleanliness. A carpenter sweeping his shop daily did so because guild expectations linked cleanliness with professionalism. Over time, such practices influenced the appearance of entire streets. Rows of tidy workshops with organized interiors created an atmosphere of quiet dignity. Even towns without strong guild presence often mirrored these habits simply because they admired the order and consistency found in guild-led trades. Guild rules unexpectedly shaped language as well. Craftsmen developed subtle ways of speaking about their work. Phrases like measure twice, honor the tool, or strength in stillness, which reflected both literal trade practices and broader values. Apprentices learned these sayings early in their training. They repeated them without question, internalizing the guild's worldview through simple expressions that guided both work and daily life. These small sayings often became proverbs used throughout the town, influencing even those who were not guild members. Beyond behavior, guild rules shaped social expectations. It became widely understood that a young person's future depended not on luck, but on patience and dedication. Parents encouraged their children to commit to learning a trade rather than seek glamorous but unstable paths. The guild's promise of stability gave families hope. When a child entered a guild, the entire household felt a sense of security. This trust in the guild system shaped the emotional landscape of medieval towns. People believed in the quiet, steady progression of learning, working, and eventually mastering a skill. Even conflict resolution reflected guild influence. Guild members learned to handle disagreements through dialogue rather than emotion. Disputes were resolved in meetings where everyone spoke calmly and listened carefully. This method of handling conflict diffused into everyday town life. People learned to discuss matters patiently, without resorting to heated exchanges. The guild's preference for order over confrontation shaped how neighbors interacted, how merchants negotiated, and how families approached disagreements. The guild's influence extended into leisure activities. Many towns held annual gatherings or feasts organized around specific crafts. These events were gentle, community-centered celebrations where craftsmen displayed work, shared meals, and welcomed townspeople. The traditions were not loud or extravagant. They were rooted in togetherness, gratitude, and pride in careful work. Children who attended these feasts grew up associating their local guild not with authority, but with community. Over decades, perhaps centuries, guild rules created a kind of personality within the towns. People acted thoughtfully, worked steadily, treated each other with quiet respect, and found comfort in the predictability of their routines. Craftsmen approached their tools with care. Townspeople approached craftsmen with trust. Families approached the future with a sense of calm expectation. If one were to walk through such a town at dusk, they would notice the result of guild influence in the smallest details. The smell of wood shavings outside a carpenter's shop, arranged in neat piles, the rhythmic clink of a blacksmith finishing his day's work while carefully cooling tools, the orderly line of pottery outside a kiln, apprentices gently closing shutters in a predictable pattern. Even the sounds reflected guild harmony, a quiet hum of activity rather than chaotic noise. Guild rules shaped people in ways far deeper than crafting methods. They taught patience in a world of uncertainty. They cultivated respect in a society often divided by class. They created unity within diverse communities. They encouraged calmness during times of change. Most importantly, they gave medieval people a way to understand themselves. Through their trades, through their routines, through their guilds, they found purpose. In a time without modern comforts, without printed manuals, without formal education systems, the strange rules of guilds acted as an invisible teacher, forming character, shaping habits, and quietly guiding entire generations toward a steady, peaceful way of life. In the calm corners of medieval towns behind wooden doors and quietly swept workshops, guilds developed a network of traditions so unusual, so specific, and at times so mysterious that they shaped the inner life of craftsmen as much as their official rules shaped their work. These customs were rarely written down and almost never discussed outside the guild. They lived through gestures, rhythms, routines, greetings, and unspoken expectations that every member learned simply by being present. And though these rituals may seem strange today, they gave medieval craftsmen something precious, a sense of belonging to a craft, to a community, and to a lineage that stretched back through generations. The origins of many guild rituals were simple habits adopted over time. A craftsman might begin his day by touching a particular tool first, not because of superstition, but because that tool grounded him in the rhythm of work. Over decades, such gestures became collectively recognized as the proper way to begin. Apprentices observed these habits silently, imitating without instruction, until entire generations repeated the same quiet actions. These gestures created a sense of continuity between past and present. A young apprentice could perform the same motion his master did, who in turn learned it from his own master, linking them all in an unbroken chain of tradition. As guilds formalized, These gestures became embedded into the inner culture of each trade. For example, carpenters in some regions had the custom of running their fingertips lightly along a wooden beam before beginning the day as shaping. This soft gesture allowed them to feel the grain, the warmth of the wood, and any imperfections. The act itself lasted only a few seconds, but it set the tone for the day, attentive, patient, fully present. Apprentices learned to pause with the same quiet care, understanding that craftsmanship began not with tools, but with touch. Blacksmiths, by contrast, often started their day with silence. Before heating the forge, many stood still for a moment, listening to the gentle creak of the workshop beams and the distant sounds of morning activity outside. This moment of stillness wasn't an official rule. It was an inherited practice, a way to prepare mind and body before the intense heat and rhythm of hammering began. The silence felt like a threshold between the calm of dawn and the steady labor that would shape the day. Weavers had their own rituals that reflected the delicate nature of their trade. Many began by tightening the loom strings slowly and evenly, humming a soft, repetitive tone as they worked. The hum wasn't meant to be musical. It was simply a guide, a way to maintain steady spacing between movements. Over time, apprentices associated certain tones with certain patterns of weaving, creating a subtle connection between sound and technique. The workshop filled with soft humming became an auditory symbol of the trade's calm, repetitive beauty. Potters often had a habit of dipping their hands into water before touching clay, even when the clay was already damp enough. This small action served as a reminder that clay responded best to gentle handling. It also helped potters center themselves before shaping material that required both firmness and softness at once. Apprentices watched and imitated this gesture without needing explanation. The water's coolness became associated with clarity and focus, qualities essential to producing well-balanced vessels. These rituals may seem minor, but they shaped the emotional landscape of guild life. They transformed workshops from mere workplaces into spaces of rhythm, continuity, and belonging. Every guild had its own set of gestures, small movements repeated daily, silently passed from one generation to the next. Beyond these individual rituals, guilds also had shared customs that governed interactions between members. When craftsmen greeted each other, they did so with gestures unique to their guilds. Bakers might touch flour-dusted palms briefly as a sign of mutual respect. Masons might tap the corner of their aprons. These greetings were gentle, understated, and meaningful only to those within the guild. They created a subtle bond, a quiet acknowledgement that everyone present understood the same traditions. Meals, too, reflected guild culture. Many guilds held communal meals where seating arrangements were based not on wealth or seniority, but on experience. Masters sat in one area, journeymen in another, apprentices in yet another, but the spacing between them wasn't hierarchical in a strict sense. Rather, it reflected the stages of learning. Apprentices observed quietly from their place, listening to discussions among masters and journeymen. They weren't excluded. They were simply absorbing the guild's shared knowledge, conversation patterns, and respectful mannerisms. These meals often included peculiar customs. In some guilds, members took turns offering toasts, but the toasts weren't celebratory in the modern sense. They were short acknowledgments of the craft, a wish for steady hands, for strong materials, for clear judgment during difficult tasks. Some toasts focused on gratitude for apprentices who had shown progress. Others thanked elders for maintaining the guild's traditions. These toasts helped reinforce the guild's identity, reminding members that their work connected them all. One of the most interesting guild customs involved the handling of tools. Guilds believed tools held the spirit of the craft, not in a mystical sense, but in the sense that tools represented years of practice, refinement, and shared knowledge. Many guilds had unwritten rules about who could handle certain tools. A master's personal tools were often off-limits to apprentices unless permission was explicitly given. Even then, apprentices were expected to touch them with exceptional care. Journeymen learned to respect these boundaries as well, understanding that tools carried meaning beyond their practical use. Some guilds required members to mark their tools with small, unique symbols. These symbols weren't signatures. They were identifiers that helped members recognize one another's work. When craftsmen saw a tool with a familiar mark, they knew its owner belonged to their guild, perhaps even to their workshop. These symbols strengthened guild loyalty. A craftsman could travel to a distant town and feel a sense of comfort upon seeing a familiar mark on a tool or piece of material. Guild meetings were another place where rituals quietly shaped behavior. These meetings were calm gatherings, rarely urgent or tense. Members arrived with orderly movements, often sitting in the same places each time. Discussions followed a predictable pattern. Masters spoke first, journeymen next, apprentices only when invited. The predictability of these meetings reinforced the guild's emphasis on patience and respect. Many guilds had a symbolic object, sometimes a candle, a chest, a bell, or a carved emblem, that represented the unity of the trade. This object was placed at the center of the meeting space. Members didn't touch it unless asked. It served as a reminder that the guild belonged to everyone, that its traditions were carried forward by all members, and that the craft itself was larger than any individual. Some guilds opened meetings with a shared phrase. These phrases were not poetic or ceremonial. They were simple acknowledgments of the craft's purpose. A carpenter's guild might begin with a phrase about working straight, symbolizing fairness and precision. A potter's guild might begin with words referencing patience. These shared phrases grounded everyone in the values of the trade. Apprentices memorized them early, feeling a sense of belonging when they joined in the recitation for the first time. Journeymen's return to the guild also followed specific customs. When a journeyman came back from travel, he was expected to present gifts, not expensive gifts, but small tokens from other towns. These could be pieces of pottery, woven cloth, carved wood, or even tools. These gifts symbolized shared learning. They were placed on the guild's central table, examined respectfully, and discussed calmly. This ritual helped members exchange knowledge about different methods, materials, and traditions across regions. Another quiet but important ritual involved mistakes. Every craftsman made them. When a piece of work didn't meet guild standards, the guild didn't shame the craftsman. Instead, there was a designated process for acknowledging the mistake. In many guilds, the craftsman would place the faulty work in a special area of the workshop or guild hall, perhaps a shelf or a corner known as the place of learning. Other members could examine it later, not to criticize, but to learn. This ritual encouraged humility, reflection, and shared improvement. Mistakes weren't hidden. They were quietly integrated into the guild's collective knowledge. Though guild rules discouraged competition, many guilds had gentle ways of recognizing excellence. These recognitions rarely took the form of awards. Instead, they appeared through small privileges. A craftsman allowed to assist with a complicated project, invited to speak at a gathering, or asked to demonstrate a technique to apprentices. These privileges served as encouragement rather than reward. They reinforced the guild's belief that mastery developed through patience, consistency, and quiet dedication. Guilds also had customs for supporting members during difficult times. If a craftsman fell ill, other members visited him regularly, not simply as friends, but as representatives of the guild. They ensured he had food, helped maintain his workshop, and supported his family. Some guilds had a designated box, kept locked with several keys held by different members. This box contained funds to support members in hardship. No single person could open the box alone. It required multiple key holders. This system symbolized collective responsibility and ensured that support was distributed fairly. Weddings and funerals also reflected guild involvement. When a craftsman married, guild members attended as a sign of unity. They often gave gifts related to the trade, tools, materials, or objects symbolizing the craft's blessings. At funerals, guild members carried symbols of the trade: aprons, chisels, weaving shuttles, or small anvils, walking slowly to honor the craftsman's contributions to the community. These customs reinforced the idea that a craftsman belonged to the guild not only in life, but in the memory of the community. Guild customs often extended into seasonal routines. During winter, workshops adapted to colder temperatures with specific practices, warming tools carefully, working earlier in the day, adjusting materials sensitive to cold. In summer, guilds adjusted schedules to avoid the hottest hours. These seasonal habits created rhythm in town life. Families collaborated with these routines, planning meals, errands, and gatherings around craft schedules. Because guild customs intertwined with daily behavior, the presence of guilds became woven into the emotional fabric of medieval life. Craftsmen felt grounded, not simply because they had a trade, but because they belonged to a system that honored their work, protected their well-being, preserved their traditions, and gave them a sense of identity that extended beyond their workshops. The guild was more than a professional organization. It was a quiet community built on shared habits, mutual respect, and the belief that craftsmanship was both a skill and a way of living. Every gesture, every ritual, every unspoken rule connected craftsmen to one another and to the generations who came before and after them. It created stability in a world where many things changed unpredictably and harmony in towns where different trades worked side by side. Through these quiet customs, strange as they may seem today, medieval guilds held communities together with a calm, steady dignity that shaped not just the work of craftsmen, but the hearts and rhythms of entire towns. By the time guilds reached their highest influence in medieval towns, their strange, detailed, and quietly enforced rules had already become more than simple guidelines for workers. They had become part of the unseen structure that held entire communities together. The calm order that guilds brought into workshops slowly expanded outward into markets, neighborhoods, and even the expectations families held for each new generation. What made guild influence so profound was not loud authority or harsh enforcement, but consistency. The predictable rhythm of rules practiced day after day, year after year, generation after generation. This steady presence created stability in a world where uncertainty was often a constant companion. Medieval life, in many ways, lacked the kinds of guarantees modern people take for granted. There were no financial institutions offering security, no standardized education systems providing predictable opportunities, and no widespread written guides outlining how to build, measure, or weave. Yet despite all this uncertainty, many towns functioned calmly thanks to guilds, whose rules provided an invisible but reliable foundation. Even people who never joined a guild still benefited from the order they created. One of the most important sources of stability was the guild's emphasis on predictable work. Everyone in a town knew that guild-trained craftsmen followed certain schedules, took careful steps to complete tasks, and produced consistent results. This meant customers rarely worried about whether an item would be ready on time or whether it would meet a certain quality standard. A baker's bread would taste the same every day. A mason's stones would align properly. A shoemaker's saws would last as expected. These outcomes were not luck. They were the products of rules that controlled everything from measurements to acceptable materials. Customers began planning their routines around this predictability. If someone needed a tool repaired, they knew exactly how long the process would take. If families purchased fabric, they trusted the width, thickness, and strength without checking every detail. This trust shaped daily life. Instead of worrying whether goods were reliable, people could focus on other responsibilities. In a world full of challenges, this small sense of security had a calming effect. Another major factor in guild-created stability was price regulation. Guilds believed that fairness depended on consistency. If prices fluctuated wildly, it would cause stress for both craftsmen and customers. To prevent this, guilds quietly agreed on price guidelines for common goods. Customers did not need to negotiate aggressively or fear being taken advantage of. Craftsmen did not need to undercut competitors or work unnaturally long hours to survive. This brought balance to the local economy, something few other institutions of the time could provide. Because guilds discouraged competition through underpricing, craftsmen saw each other not as rivals, but as colleagues. This mindset reduced tension within towns. Workshops could exist close to one another without conflict. Craftsmen often loaned each other tools, shared materials during shortages, or assisted with large projects. These cooperative exchanges were supported by the guild rules that promoted unity over rivalry. Neighborhoods with many guild members often felt warm and peaceful because of this cooperation. Guild-supported stability extended to families as well. Parents who enrolled their children as apprentices did so knowing that the guild provided a structured future. The apprenticeship system, with its clear progression from apprentice to journeyman to master, gave families a sense of direction. They knew their children would learn discipline, craftsmanship, and community values. Unlike many medieval occupations that depended heavily on unpredictable conditions, guild trades offered longevity. A child who learned a craft could practice it for life, eventually passing it on to the next generation. This sense of continuity tied families to guilds across decades. Entire lineages became known for specific trades. Generations of carpenters, weavers, or potters shaped the identity of families and towns alike. This multigenerational connection strengthened the emotional bond people felt toward their guild. They were not simply workers. They were caretakers of traditions that began long before they were born and would continue long after they were gone. Guild rules also stabilized towns by preventing sudden changes in craftsmanship standards. Without guilds, a new worker might introduce inferior materials or rushed methods, disrupting the established trust between craftsmen and customers. Guilds prevented this by thoroughly training all members and ensuring that all followed the same expectations. Even if a new master opened a shop, customers trusted his work because they trusted the guild behind him. This continuity preserved the reputation of each trade. Another subtle way guilds maintained stability was by helping members during hardship. Medieval life was filled with unpredictable events: illness, injury, shortages, or the loss of a workshop. Guilds recognized that an unstable craftsman could not contribute to the stability of the town. Because of this, most guilds created systems of mutual support. Members contributed small amounts of money or material to a shared fund, used to help craftsmen in need. This fund wasn't used often, but when it was, it prevented families from falling into economic difficulty. This was especially comforting in a period without social safety nets. It allowed craftsmen to recover without fear of losing their livelihood. This communal support extended to families as well. If a craftsman passed away unexpectedly, the guild might step in to help the widow manage the workshop or find apprenticeships for the children. They might maintain the workshop until an apprentice finished training or until the family decided what to do. These quiet acts of support strengthened the bond between guild members and their community. They also fostered loyalty. Craftsmen understood that the guild would stand by them in difficult times, and so they willingly followed guild rules in return. Guilds also brought stability through their influence on town planning. Many towns structured their markets, streets, and business districts around guild activity. Areas near the marketplace became known for particular trades. One street for leatherworkers, another for woodworkers, another for bakers. This clustering made it easier for customers to find what they needed. It also helped craftsmen collaborate, sharing supplies, exchanging information, and tackling large projects together. These organized neighborhoods created predictable economic zones that shaped the daily flow of townspeople. Workshops themselves were built with stability in mind. Guilds often shared guidelines for construction: how large a woodworking bench needed to be, how far a forge should sit from the door, how high racks should be for storing materials. As a result, workshops across towns looked similar. This familiarity allowed journeymen to adapt quickly to new locations and helped maintain consistent craft quality. A workshop built to guild standards felt natural to any guild-trained craftsman, reducing stress and increasing efficiency. Another crucial factor in guild stability was communication. Guilds held regular meetings to discuss trade issues, share information about material shortages, adjust price guidelines, or settle disputes. These meetings followed predictable procedures: calm discussion, respectful listening, and collective decision-making. These habits created a stable governing environment within the guild. Guild members trusted that important matters would be resolved fairly because the process itself encouraged patience and cooperation. This governance model influenced broader town politics as well. Councils often adopted similar methods because the guild's calm approach proved effective. Town stability was also strengthened by the guild's role in managing seasonal rhythms. Different seasons affected trades differently. Winter slowed construction but increased demand for candles or warm clothing. Summer provided ideal conditions for tanning leather but required adjustments for bakers. Guilds shared seasonal knowledge among members, helping them anticipate challenges and prepare accordingly. This allowed towns to function smoothly throughout the year, even when weather or daylight changed drastically. Guild festivals also reinforced stability, though they appeared simple on the surface. These events marked specific times in the year: vanishing winter, the arrival of spring, the completion of major projects, or the advancement of apprentices. These festivals created a predictable structure in community life. Townspeople looked forward to them not only for the festivities, but for the reassurance they provided. In unpredictable times, recurring celebrations created a sense of rhythm that helped people feel grounded. Perhaps the most important stabilizing force of all was the culture of calmness that guilds fostered. Their rules emphasized patience, respect, and careful work. They discouraged rushing, boasting, and unnecessary risks. This atmosphere seeped into the broader community, influencing how people interacted in markets, workshops, and homes. At a time when many cities across the world experienced rapid change, medieval guild towns stood out for their steadiness. People trusted the system because it rarely surprised them. They followed guild guidelines not out of fear, but out of appreciation for the harmony that resulted. Over generations, this calmness became a defining characteristic of guild-led communities. Entire towns took on the personality of their trades, steady as carpenter's saws, rhythmic like a weaver's loom, quietly strong like a mason's stone. Guild rules shaped not only work, but life itself. They created a foundation that allowed generations to grow, learn, and prosper with a sense of certainty that was rare in medieval times. In the end, the strange rules of guilds, whether regulating the width of fabric, the hours of workshops, or the greeting rituals between craftsmen, became the silent architecture of stability. They held medieval communities together through calm routine, patient craftsmanship, mutual support, and shared identity. Through these rules, guilds built not just objects, but entire worlds of consistency where people could live with trust, order, and quiet confidence. As medieval guilds matured and their internal rules deepened into daily habits, something subtle began happening across the landscape of Europe. Towns that had never communicated formally, cities separated by forests or rivers, and villages that rarely saw travelers started developing remarkably similar patterns of behavior, craftsmanship, and even social expectations. It wasn't due to royal decrees or written treaties. It happened quietly, almost invisibly, through the movements of craftsmen guided by the calm, predictable rhythms of guild life. Guilds did not exist in isolation. Journeymen traveled, masters visited markets, craftsmen relocated to seek new opportunities, and merchants carried goods shaped by distant hands. Through these slow, peaceful channels, guild rules moved from one community to another, not rigidly, not identically, but like seeds carried by a steady breeze, taking root wherever conditions allowed. Over time, this created a gentle but powerful web of connections that linked people who had never met, yet shared the same values of consistency, fairness, and careful work. In the early centuries of guild development, each town's guilds grew independently. Local materials, climate, and traditions shaped how craftsmen worked. But as trade expanded, craftsmen could not remain isolated. A potter in one region began hearing about glazes used in another. A carpenter discovered that towns far away angled their roofs differently to resist rain. A baker learned about how bread rose better in cooler ovens. Much of this knowledge spread through journeymen, young craftsmen who had completed apprenticeships and were now expected to travel, observe, and learn from other towns. Journeymen were the quiet messengers of guild culture. They traveled mostly on foot, sometimes with caravans, occasionally with merchants. Their paces were slow, their journeys long, and their observations keen. In each new town, they worked alongside local craftsmen, absorbing their routines. They noticed how guild elders conducted meetings, how tools were stored, how materials were sourced, and which customs were unique to that town. They also carried their own guild's habits with them, displaying methods learned in distant workshops. These exchanges weren't formal. They happened through conversation, observation, and shared labor. When journeymen returned to their home guilds, they brought pieces of other regions with them. A new way of shaping handles, a careful way of organizing materials, or a small courtesy shown during guild gatherings. Nothing dramatic, nothing disruptive, just subtle refinements that blended quietly into local customs. Over generations, these tiny exchanges connected guilds across wide distances. Entire regions began sharing similar rituals, similar quality standards, and similar expectations for behavior. And yet each town retained its individuality, shaped by local traditions. Merchants played a role in this process as well. As they carried goods from town to town, cloth from the north, pottery from the south, carved objects from mountain regions, they naturally compared the quality and style of different craftsmen. When they admired a particular method or design, they told craftsmen in other towns about it. These conversations weren't formal requests. Merchants weren't trying to shape guilds. They simply shared observations, and craftsmen listened. A carpenter might hear that a distant town produced wooden chests with a unique joint that lasted longer. He would try it. A potter might hear about a smoother slip used elsewhere. She would experiment with it. Guilds absorbed these ideas, refined them, and quietly passed them along. Regional guild gatherings emerged over time. Small, peaceful events where representatives from different towns met to exchange knowledge, view each other's craftsmanship, and discuss broader issues. These gatherings weren't political. They didn't involve decisions that would affect entire regions. Instead, they acted as meeting points for craftsmen who valued precision and patience. They compared the width of cloth rolls, the tone of metals, the consistency of dyes, or the shape of tools. They discussed shortages of materials or shared techniques for tackling seasonal challenges. These gentle exchanges reinforced a sense of unity across distances. Because guild rules shape behavior, not just craftsmanship, people across regions slowly developed similar manners. A craftsman traveling hundreds of miles could walk into a workshop and immediately understand the rhythm of work. He recognized the silence before the day began, the way tools were stored, the way mistakes were set aside for learning, or the way apprentices moved with quiet attention. Even the subtle greetings between members felt familiar, despite variations in wording or gesture. This familiarity helped travelers feel at home in distant towns. They knew they belonged to a tradition that stretched far beyond the walls of their local guild hall. Guild culture also influenced trade routes. Merchants preferred traveling between towns where guilds maintained stable prices and predictable quality. These routes became more popular, more prosperous, and more interconnected. Over time, entire networks of trade formed around guild-centered towns, increasing economic stability across wide regions. Without announcing it, guilds became anchors of regional commerce. Their quiet influence reached beyond workshops and into the broader flow of goods, materials, and information. Local rulers began to notice this too. Towns with strong guilds tended to be calmer, more organized, and more economically reliable. This predictability encouraged rulers to support guild practices, sometimes by offering tax privileges, sometimes by recognizing guild authority in disputes. These interactions strengthened guild influence further, helping ensure their customs spread more easily to neighboring towns. When a new settlement began to grow, one of the first steps taken was often the formation of guilds, modeled after those in nearby regions. But even as guild influence expanded, the spread of rules remained gentle and natural. Guild members didn't travel with the intention to change other towns. They simply worked, observed, conversed, and shared. Their consistency made them reliable. Their values made them respected. Their calm, steady work made them memorable. People in new towns often adopted guild habits simply because they admired the organization, stability, and dignity those habits brought. One of the most interesting ways guild rules spread involved apprentices who moved with their masters. In some trades, masters traveled to other towns to complete large projects, cathedrals, bridges, mills, or specialized houses. When they traveled, they often took apprentices with them. These apprentices worked alongside craftsmen from other regions, absorbing their methods. They returned home with new insights that blended with local customs. Over decades, this subtle movement of knowledge created a shared understanding of craftsmanship that stretched across vast areas. Another channel of subtle influence came from materials themselves. Cloth dyed in one region carried the color methods of that place to distant markets. Tools forged in a particular town reflected the metalworking traditions of that guild. Pottery styles traveled in the hands of merchants and pilgrims. Customers noticed these variations, and craftsmen began discussing the qualities of goods from faraway towns. Sometimes they adopted new designs, other times they refined their own. This gentle exchange helped guild rules evolve, not through drastic change, but through the slow incorporation of ideas that improved the craft. Some guilds developed cross-regional partnerships. Weavers in one valley might have connections with weavers in a distant coastal town. They shared information about new threads, dyes, or weaving patterns. Over time, these partnerships created invisible bridges between communities. Even though craftsmen in one region might never meet those in another, they followed similar standards, spoke similar professional languages, and trusted the same values. As these connections grew, guild-trained craftsmen developed a unique sense of identity, one that transcended their hometowns. They felt part of a larger brotherhood of work, shared knowledge, and careful craftsmanship. Even if they never traveled, they knew that someone far away was shaping wood or clay with the same steady gestures, training apprentices with the same quiet patience, or organizing workshops with the same thoughtful order. This recognition gave craftsmen a sense of belonging that was rare in the medieval world. Guild influence wasn't identical everywhere. Each region added its own flavor to guild customs. Northern towns shaped their rules around cold climates, emphasizing insulation and seasonal preparation. Southern towns developed rules centered on materials suited to warmer weather. Mountain towns refined methods for working with stone, while coastal towns created traditions influenced by maritime trade. These differences enriched guild culture rather than dividing it. They showed that guild rules could adapt to local needs while maintaining shared core values. The result was a Europe where craftsmen from different regions felt connected even without direct communication. A carpenter from a mountain village who traveled to a coastal city would quickly feel familiar rhythms in the workshop there. The measured approach to cutting wood, the respectful way apprentices waited for instruction, the steady routines that shaped each day. Familiarity comforted traveling craftsmen. They recognized the guild in the environment long before anyone introduced themselves. This shared identity became a stabilizing force during periods of change. When markets shifted or new materials arrived, guild connections allowed knowledge to move smoothly across regions. Craftsmen discussed new challenges in calm tones, drawing on the experience of distant guilds whose members they had never met. These invisible networks helped preserve order during times that might otherwise have caused confusion or instability. Over generations, guild influence became one of the quietest yet most enduring forces shaping medieval Europe. While kings and nobles rose and fell, while borders shifted and conflict stirred, the calm traditions of guild life remained steady. Apprentices continued to sweep workshops at dawn. Journeymen continued to travel, observe, and learn. Masters continued to guide with patience. Tools continued to be handled with respect. And guild rules continued to offer the same stability they always had. Guilds did not seek power. They did not aim to unify regions. Yet their steady habits created a form of unity stronger than any decree. Through quiet consistency, guild rules wove distant communities together into a tapestry of shared practices, shared values, and shared identity. From workshop to workshop, town to town, region to region, the influence spread not by command, but by example, slow, patient, and profoundly human. In the end, the story of guild expansion is not one of domination or reform. It is the story of thoughtful workers whose routines, rituals, and dedication created harmony across vast distances. A harmony built, not with loud declarations, but with the steady rhythm of hands shaping wood, clay, cloth, and metal, each gesture carrying the quiet wisdom of guild life into another corner of the world. Thank you for spending this quiet, gentle journey with me, wandering through the calm, hidden world of medieval guilds, where rules were soft, routines were steady, and everyday life moved to the slow rhythm of careful work. It's peaceful to imagine a time when entire towns found balance not through noise or pressure, but through patient tradition and craftspeople who quietly shaped their communities, one small gesture at a time. If tonight's story helped you relax or drift closer to sleep, don't forget to like the video. It really supports the channel. And if you enjoy these soft, soothing walks through history, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next bedtime chapter. Before you fall asleep, I'd love to hear from you. Which guild or craft felt the most interesting or calming to you? Leave a comment. Your thoughts help guide future episodes. Rest well, sleep deeply, and I'll see you again in the next peaceful journey through history.